All right, well, it's really delightful to be able to share with you some of the different projects that I've been looking at, really, that come under the guise of CyberInfrastructure Frameworks for Community-Driven Science. And this is really kind of we're entering what I would call a new era of community-driven science. And this is really driven by a lot of needs. What I'm going to try to convince you of today is that even though this is I'm giving a talk in kind of for the Institute on Ecosystems, I'm going to talk about a number of different community efforts for using advanced cyber infrastructure and data sharing to further their research needs. And so for all of these communities that I'll describe, the needs are really this new, not so new, but to be able to collaborate across science domains, disciplines, and especially distance. I'll talk about some international efforts. One of the major challenges is to be able to discover, understand, access heterogeneous distributed data that's created by a number of different types of communities. And to be able to use that data for data analysis, visualization, and tools that different communities have developed, and also to educate a new generation of scientists within this new kind of community-driven scientific endeavor. Now, what I'll describe for some of the different communities is some of the frameworks that have grown up. A lot of this work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, as well as Department of Energy and USGS and others. And what I want to try to convince you is that there's the needs for all these different communities, even though they're very disparate in terms of their science aims, are really very similar. Many of these communities depend on high-performance networks to gather data from distant places, high-performance computing, data management, and also analysis tools. And the goal is really to be able to discover data, to aggregate it, access it. And one of the biggest challenges in this whole endeavor is the development of a kind of robust, sustainable software infrastructure to support all of this. I'm going to talk about a bunch of different communities just to show you, and what I want to do is to weave some of these common themes through these different communities. First, I'll talk about plant biologists, spend a little time on ecologists, environmental and earth scientists, then move into my domain, which is neuroscience, talk a little bit about health IT and why sharing data is important and why your life might depend on it, and end up talking a little bit about citizen science. About halfway through, I'm going to remind you about some of the challenges that are inherent and some of the new technologies that we need to develop, and specifically the areas of new expertise in terms of scientists that need to be developed. So, anyone here heard of the IPlant Collaborative, funded by the National Science Foundation? Any plant biologists any plant biologists here? Too bad, because if you're a plant biologist, this is the best thing that could happen to you. So the IPlant Collaborative, I used to be on the board of directors for this, is a $50 million project funded by the National Science Foundation to create basically cyber infrastructure for the plant biology community. And one of the things that they've done, which is characteristic of a lot of these big projects, is to pick a few grand challenge kind of driving biological problems to help inform the development of the infrastructure, then to develop the infrastructure for plant biologists to be able to go to a common place, a discovery environment, and have access to data, tools, computational resources, and a number of other different environmental things, and basically to be able to push their science forward. So this project has been going on now for about 4 years. And the infrastructure they've developed is really, I think, one of the best out there. And a lot of this is because the two co-PIs, one of the PIs is a plant biologist, and the other is a computer scientist, Dan Stanzione, who's the associate director of the Texas Advanced Supercomputing Center. And so he really knows how to build infrastructure, and they've done a great job. So here's the kind of cyber infrastructure stack for this whole community. First off is the discovery environment, and this is kind of your one-stop shopping environment where basically, and all of this is free to plant biologists anywhere. You can log in, create an account, and you have access to data sets, tools, analysis. And if you're, a lot of this is high throughput sequencing and advanced genome analysis. And so if your project is big enough, you can actually just port it to the supercomputer centers there seamlessly in Texas. They've also created a cloud infrastructure service platform, so that basically the scientist doesn't have anything on their own desktop. They're accessing all of this stuff, quote, in the cloud. They have a data store that's based on a metadata standards created by the IRODS program. This has been around for a while. And also, they've done a lot of work on their foundational API, which allows the different components to actually talk to each other. Now, all these big projects often have an educational component. And what they've developed here with Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories is called the DNA Subway. It's a great set of tools for young investigators and students as well to learn how to do different kinds of genome analysis. So it's very easy to access and easy to use. One of the things that's come out of this is that a number of smaller companies and smaller groups of investigators are now leveraging the infrastructure that's in place. So they have a number of different little companies that are now powered by the IPlant infrastructure. So this is one of these kind of soup to nuts infrastructures that's available to basically to anyone who wants to log in and take advantage of it. And kind of the benefits to the community are that individuals who may be at an institution that isn't the University of Arizona or isn't at a supercomputing center can actually access this environment remotely and take advantage of the entire infrastructure. So that's one to take a look at, and especially if you have friends who are plant biologists, to let them know that this exists. Now this group is probably very familiar with the NEON program, which is been now, I'm not sure how many years in the planning, 6, 7 years in the planning now. Actually, it's more than that. It's been around for quite a long time. So this is a huge project funded by NSF to build a 30-year continental scale observatory. And what's really interesting about this project is the types of data, not only the many heterogeneous types of data that they're going to try to collect and integrate, but also the way that they've set out the collection plan. So the whole United States, and again, this is just a US project, has been divided into these different zones. And so for each one of these zones, they'll collect observational data, sensor-based data, lots of different kinds. And also, one of the other things they're going to do is a bunch of airborne observations, so to use really advanced remote sensing techniques. And so ultimately what will happen over time is that each one of these individual regions and the individual sites will have these long-term observational platforms for collecting data. And the idea is to be able to do both this point sampling, observational data, as well as remote sensing using these airborne observations, and then take this data, integrate it with models, and come up with ecological forecasting to really look at some of the agricultural systems, climate change, forest management. Huge project. So far, there's only been, I think, 3 sites that are under construction to be deployed, and I think there's kind of a 5-year time span, but data will be collected over 30 years. So this will be a very rich data source. Interestingly, and when I get to the later parts of the talk, these groups haven't really decided exactly what's the minimal set of information they want to collect for each of their observations or airborne observations. So there's a lot of kind of work within the community to set up those standards and decide how to make sure that the information that they collect is actually usable by the whole community. So, anyone heard of Beta1? Beta1 is another big NSF project, which is basically this was a competitive. There was a competition, the NSF DataNet competition. Beta1 is for ecological data. It actually stands for Data Observation Network for Earth. They have really 3 goals. It's based out of, mostly out of the University in New Mexico. 3 goals to create this cyber infrastructure for collecting, managing, and using this data. It's based on a set of member nodes, and I'll show you where those member nodes are located. So each one of the member nodes is then going to contribute data into the infrastructure. They've created a number of 2 tools so far, and a number of different tools are under development to be able to use the data, and they have a big effort in community engagement and outreach, and also in training. And this is a group that's really kind of taken on, for the first time that I've seen, really basic education in data management, trying to understand the full data lifecycle, how to basically collect, annotate, store, and share data. So there's a lot of educational efforts that are going along with this. So I thought I would show you what a couple of these tools are, and I actually tried one out for the for my notes. Are again University of New Mexico, UC Santa Barbara, where NCEAS has been for many years, and the University of Tennessee at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So we've got some good cyber infrastructure folks there. They chose an interesting group of member nodes, and again, this is going to be a growing list over time. South African National Parks, the Knowledge Network for Biocomplexity, which is a long-standing effort for kind of data collection and annotation out of UC Santa Barbara. Ecological Society, Dryad, is also a data collection group. All these different groups are involved. I'll tell you more about our project and how we would like to become a member node of Beta1. So far they've put out 2 different tools that are useful. So the idea is that the member nodes contribute data to the infrastructure. They use a common markup language for annotating their data. And then through this search engine, which they just released, I think this summer, there's a way in which you can retrieve data from by typing in particular different search words. And I'll show you the results of a search in a second. Data Up is something that was developed by the California Digital Libraries. It's the simplest tool for data management I've seen yet. And the goal is really to try to preserve what's called orphan data. So oftentimes when people they get their grant proposal, they do their work, most of their data is stored in Excel spreadsheets, their grant ends, they publish their papers, the data sits on their laptops or is lost to the community. And so the idea about Data Up is it has a very simple interface, and what it does is to assign, so it's basically designed for spreadsheet data, what it does is assign a unique identifier to your little spreadsheet of data, and then you can store it in their repository. So this is kind of a way to be able to store data that would otherwise be lost. It's a very simple interface, and so far there's not a lot of data in there, but we tried it and it seems to work. Here's the search engine again, and I wanted to try this out just to see if I could do a search and see what kind of information I would get back. And I want you to remember this interface because I'm going to show you another one later developed by a different community that does essentially the same thing. Has a bunch of member nodes, annotates data according to controlled vocabularies. And so the search that I did here, just for fun, was I typed in black cat chickadee because I saw one of those in my yard today. Typed it in and I got one record back. And this is the record that I got. And so this is the EML view, so this is a markup language. And essentially what this is a page of text with a bunch of information. Now this part down here I think is impenetrable. I have no idea how you parse this additional information. Lots of information about where the sites are, the sightings of the birds, and different types of things. So this is basically what you get back. And so the idea here is, how usable is this information? Data1 is really just getting started, and so obviously this information was contributed by this person at some point. It was discovered through the search engine, and this is what you would get back in terms of usable data. Let's see. So as I said before, one of the goals of the Beta1 project is to create and encourage many individual data providers or data contributors to join their member network and, and create different kinds of tools that would allow them to submit data to Beta1. This is our project called VOICE, the Virtual Observatory and Ecological Informatics System, that was developed in collaboration with Sean Cleveland, who is here. Sean, raise your hand. And Thomas C. Dirks, and and also Clem Izurita. Where are you, Clem? So this is a project that we've worked on now for almost 3 years to develop an informatics system for basically sensor-based data. So there's this system allows you to set up an observation site, locate your sensors, and be able to stream data live into the infrastructure. We've worked really hard on this in terms of using really good software engineering principles and to be able to have this system interoperable with others. One thing I'll say is that this is really a data management system. I'm going to show you a lot of different software tools, but this is a data management system that allows someone to set up their project, decide who's a member of their project, give people different levels of access, import their data, do quality control, QA, QC, with a number of different tools that we've developed, and then ultimately push the data, publish the data to a national center, which is the quasi-HIS distribution for the hydrology community. So this data, so the data is actually managed within VOICE and then pushed into a national distribution point for data sharing. One of the things that we worked hard on is to make sure that the investigator feels that they have enough control of their data, that they can manage it, clean it up, use it, and when they're ready to then make it public, that is under the investigator's control. So this is an ongoing project here at Montana State and also at University of Montana, and we're really open to having anyone use this software platform and hopefully encourage some other users to adopt it. And so, I was talking to Sean the other day, so our challenge now to how would we integrate the VOICE system with the Beta1 system? Well, basically, we have an API. I always say the royal we. I'm not a developer. Sean and Paul Levette developed most of this to try to figure out, can our software system talk to the Beta1 system? And we can ask Sean later how that's going. Basically, what it involves is getting into the Beta1 site, trying to understand their application programming interface and see if we can link the two. And if we can, then anyone who uses VOICE as a data management system should be able to publish their data to Beta1. That's our longer-term goal. Okay, let's talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk just a little bit now about some international efforts that have been going on. So far I've talked about some kind of local efforts and continental efforts. Pragma is the Pacific Rim Applications and Grid Middleware Assembly. That's really a mouthful, but this is a project that's now, let's see, going into its 10th year now. The goal of this project, it's really interesting, has a 10-year history of developing kind of on-the-fly research collaborations between international groups. And these are all the sites that are members of Pragma. There's a lot, most of this is Pacific Rim, also folks in Australia and other places. And one of the ideas was, can you set up kind of a robust, kind of almost cloud infrastructure that contains the application layer, the grid middleware layer, the authentication layers, to basically put together on the fly a collaboration that's an international one. So one of the things that they talk about in Pragma is the development of a trust envelope. So these are interesting collaborations from a number of standpoints. A trust envelope in which investigators from, say, UCSD could work with folks in Korea or Japan to work on a project over a short period of time, but feel confident that their data was enclosed in this trust envelope, that they were able to control who had access to the data and who had access to the different kinds of applications. And that's been really successful, and it's also been a real kind of rubber meets the road test of a lot of these systems that are trying to build these grid middleware systems where different virtual machines are supposed to be able to talk to each other. So some of the applications, the other part of this that, sorry that I forgot to tell you, the other part that's really interesting is there's a student component that goes along with all of these international collaborations. So when they set up a collaboration, on each end, students are recruited to join the collaboration, and they work either remotely using collaboration tools, and often the students will go and visit the country. So one of the things that's come out of this, especially for these young investigators, is really to develop much more of a global perspective. So if you're just working with your collaborators in America, you know, there are certain rules of engagement. But when you start to work with collaborators in Japan, China, Korea, other places, there's all kinds of cultural differences in terms of interactions that can either make or break a successful collaboration. So one of the projects, there's a couple projects that they've worked on. One, the recent earthquake in Japan, since this network was already set up, they were able to quickly do, because they had not only these personal trust relationships, but also this kind of cyber infrastructure in place, they were able to do disaster recovery for a number of the different institutions very quickly to get their systems back up and running by basically running them remotely. And so this was something that happened on the fly. They were also, a number of folks were involved in the SARS outbreak when they were trying to contain the spread of the disease. A number of the folks that were involved in that were in Australia. And so the other characteristic of this project is meetings. So they have meetings all the time, and the meetings go from Japan to Korea. And really the whole idea is building this personal network as well as kind of the more technical network. Now one of the projects that, so they have these things called science expeditions, and one of the ones that they're working on now, which I think would be interested this group, is called GLEON. It's called the Global Lake Ecological Observatory Network. So this is really an international collaboration. And let's see if I can look up here. Here's the different GLEON sites. So these are all different lakes in different areas. And the idea is to really compare information in really widely distributed different parts of the Earth, looking for indicators of climate change like eutrophication and anthropogenic different kinds of influences that may impact the health of lakes. And so this community, these communities are kind of self-forming. This community, their common focus is trying to understand the ecology of lakes, but they're always constantly recruiting postdocs and graduate students to join their groups, different areas. So this is a really kind of cool project that's been going on for a while. Okay, so now I'm going to take a little break here and talk a little bit more about the technical challenges of doing all these things. I've been talking in these glowing terms about these great interactions and collaborative groups, but this is actually a pretty hard thing to do. Hard from a kind of culture point of view as well as a technical point of view. And a lot of this we really learned from firsthand from the Voice Project, which was a team of developers working very closely with the users to try to figure out how do we build the best system that will actually meet their needs. So these requirements, and these are true for any kind of data management system or any kind of cyber infrastructure platform, if the real goal is to be able to have well-managed data and also to be able to share it with others or make it publicly accessible. So first, data has to be digital. If your data isn't digital, if it's a piece of paper, if it's in your notebook, if it's an image that's in a folder in your desk, it's not shareable. So data must be digital in order to be shared and in order to be used in a number of different ways. Data has to be described using a set of controlled vocabularies, or at least people have to agree on the same sets of terms that they're going to use to describe their data. Data provenance must be preserved. So provenance has to do with, if you have, say, I don't know, I would like to use the idea of, an image. Let's say you have an image, you have a really pretty picture. That image is basically useless unless there's some information that is associated with it. If you think about, maybe your grandmother pulls out a box of photographs of your family from years and years, and you go through that box and you pull out a photograph and you say, who is this? Well, your grandmother probably knows, but if nobody wrote anything on the back of the photograph, you'd never know who that person was. So that's just a really simple example of data provenance. This is a huge challenge. Data must be discoverable via some kind of a search query or an API access. There's data everywhere in all kinds of databases that's essentially invisible or impenetrable or unreachable through programmatic access, unless the system that you've designed permits that data to be discoverable through different kinds of API access and others. And also, data access really must be controlled. I'm going to give you an example of that for health informatics in a little bit. But this is something that really is near and dear to the investigator's heart. Much data is really hard won, and there are lots of situations in which you want to make sure who has access to your data. When you're ready to make it public, that's fine, but before that, you have to have some kind of access controls in place. Talk about motivation. This is one of the biggest challenges now, even though I'm talking about a lot of these projects where people are really engaged in data sharing and lots of success stories. Data management takes time. It takes time, and it often takes time away from what you might think of as your real science, the science of gathering the data or running the simulations or doing whatever. Actually, annotating your data takes time, and so that sometimes is a real deterrent. Real data management actually requires professional staff. I like this little poster I found. Professional curators are actually now becoming essential parts of research teams where it's important that the data is well managed and well curated. One of the hardest things, and this is everywhere, there are no reward structures in place for managing your data, unless your reward structure is that you get to have this great collaboration with your collaborators. If you think about it, what's the reward for doing science? I mean, in terms of being in a university environment. The only thing that's really rewarded are papers that are published. So you publish your paper, it goes on your CV, that's what helps you get promoted, helps you get your next grant application. But there aren't any reward structures in place yet, and I say yet because we hope this is coming, for, in addition to your paper that you published, also publishing that data set so that someone might reuse it. So that's something that really is a culture change that hasn't happened yet. And there's a number of groups that are working towards that. This, I think, is one of the other biggest barriers to really having a robust kind of national infrastructure for data sharing and exchange and collaboration, is that the software that we've developed, so we've developed software, lots of people have developed great software tools. Sustaining that software is very difficult given the current funding climate. Because right now, developing a software tool is funded under the same kinds of situations as doing a research grant. So you get 3 years, you develop your software tool, the funding ends, and then, but at that point, it's not like you can take that software and it's going to run forever. It needs to be maintained, it needs to be upgraded, more features need to be added. So this is something that the funding agencies are grappling with, because often developing a great software tool that then gets used by the community, you get lots of, that's actually a way in which you're rewarded for developing something like that. But if you want to then renew your grant, then to continue to maintain that software, to continue for that tool to be used by the community. So what's new about that? You know, what's transformative about maintaining your software platform? So this is a really difficult challenge now, and the funding agencies are really kind of grappling with this at this point. At the same time, that we all know the National Science Foundation now requires a data management plan when you turn in your grant. What's interesting is that they require a plan. They don't actually require you to, you know, make your data available at the end of the funding period. And the National Institutes of Health are starting to get on board with that as well. So it may be coming. Okay. Let's talk about why this is hard, why some of this stuff is hard. So one of the things about maintaining your data and curating your data is that you need to use the same sets of terms, and communities need to agree on the same sets of terms. So these three pictures are all the same thing. This is a human spine. This is a cactus spine. Anyone know what this one is? These are dendritic spines. So spelled the same way, spine, spine, spine. A computer can't tell you, doesn't know the difference between that unless each one of those terms is actually annotated with a meaning that goes along with it. So there are actually groups, there's a National Center now for Biomedical Ontologies that goes through and actually classifies these terms in terms of their semantic meaning. So not only do you need to figure out which terms to use, you have to make sure that the computer understands what you mean by that term. And so there's ways to do that, but that takes a lot of extra effort. Many communities now, when they're trying to really working on trying to exchange valuable data, are starting to come up with some data standards for the minimal information that needs to be collected for a particular experiment so that that data can be shared. So NIFTY was developed by the neuroimaging community, Neuroimaging Informatics Technology Initiative, and that sets a set of standard descriptions for neuroimaging data. For those folks that use microarray analysis, which is one of the major culprits of the data deluge that you hear about, these folks have come up with a set of standards called the Miami standards. And what those really are, so again, as I was saying before, here's my data, here's a picture. You know, this is totally useless unless you know, how did I design my experiment? What protocols did I use to spot the plate? How did I run it? All that kind of stuff. So the data in and of itself is useless without those descriptors. For folks that work in neuroscience in terms of time series analysis, they're also coming up with a minimum set of information about a neuroscience investigation. What's interesting about this is that isn't this what used to be in our materials and methods in our papers? And so why is that not enough, and why is that not searchable and parsable, and why do you actually have to tag your data with this? Well, I think a lot of that has to do with the other explosion that's taking place along with the explosion of data that's out there. And that's just the explosion in the literature. And I know within kind of the biomedical world, there's so much literature out there, people really can't find what they're looking for. It's very difficult. And there's major efforts now to develop natural language processing algorithms to go through and read a bunch of abstracts and then pick out those descriptor terms so that when you do a search over the literature, you actually get back a set of papers that are relevant to what you're looking for. Okay, so I want to talk now about how the neuroscience community has really taken on this challenge. And this has been an effort that's been going on for about, I would say, 7 or 8 years now. And I think, you know, not just because I'm a neuroscientist, but this is actually a very impressive effort. It's called the Neuroscience Information Framework. And what this is basically, if you think about it, a data portal for all things neuroscience. And it was set up along the exact kind of the same ideas. I mean, it really, this has been going on much longer than the Beta1 effort. But the idea is that what they did was to basically create an ontology of controlled vocabulary terms. And so what you can do is if you have a resource of data that you'd like to share, you have your own database, or they also did it for the literature as well, each one of those resources was then curated against that ontology and then could be registered within the Neuroscience Information Framework. And you probably can't read this from here, but I'll tell you what types of things you can actually find through this framework. So, and it's pretty impressive if you look, oops, I'll go back for a second. So basically, literature, all kinds of data types have been registered: animals, antibodies, biospecimens, brain activation foci, drugs, grants, images, microarray analysis. All of this stuff is now accessible through this portal. So this is your way to find everything that's associated with neuroscience, and it's really pretty dramatic, and I'll show you an example. So what you can do is just type in the search box up here, something, an antibody you're looking for, a mouse model you're looking for, a disease model you're looking for, and you get back an amazing amount of information. So I did that I typed in Parkinson's disease here, just as one. What it did was it took my query and kind of parsed that into a couple different ways of asking the same question. And then these were the results that I got back. And this is just one page. So if you look along this side here, there are 258 entries for brain atlas, 285 images, 96 different kinds of antibodies, 8,522 records of negative data, which is interesting, clinical trials, biospecimens, multimedia, microarrays, all this stuff. So all that was retrieved by me simply typing in Parkinson's disease. You can do a lot more kind of complicated and elegant queries, but the real usefulness of this system is that what's returned is not just links. You can actually get real data. You can dig down in, and depending on at what level someone has registered their resource with the Neuroscience Information Framework, that data is now available to you. So I think, which one did I pick? I just expanded this one. GEMMA is a database that's for meta-analysis of gene expression data. So each one of these records here has been curated according to these different terms, but this is actually a link to download the real data. So this is all data that people has been made available for the neuroscience community. Interestingly, the Neuroscience Information Framework was funded on a 5-year contract from the National Institute of Drug Abuse and a few others, and that 5-year contract ends in about 6 months. So, long-term sustainability of this resource, who knows? But look at the impact. Each one of these little dots here represents a resource of data that's available to the community through this portal. I just picked out 2 for fun here. This is the Allen Institute of Brain Science there in Seattle. This is the Chinese Academy of Sciences. This is actually a tumor registry here. You can't really read that very well. This is a set of atlases of gene expression. Whoops, I'll go back for a second, in the mouse brain. The neat thing about the NIF side is if you look at the NIF statistics, these get upgraded all the time. So every time a new resource is added, those numbers go up. So this is truly an international effort, basically, and the goal is to find useful data. And the way it's been done is based on kind of an ontology and a resource registration. Okay, let's talk a little bit about health IT and informatics for healthcare. So I think now, 10 years ago, certainly, we really didn't have electronic medical records. This has been growing over time. But right now, I would say the health IT community is completely conflicted about how to do this. Everyone knows it's really important. The software that's typically developed for health information is either proprietary or pretty hard to use. So one of the National Centers for Biomedical Computing, called I2B2, has developed a software platform basically for doing all those things that I was just talking about. Here's the patient information, what kind of diagnosis did they get, what kind of drug did they take, all that kind of stuff. And this is actually downloadable software that you can get and deploy. And it's now been deployed all over the United States at the clinical and translational science centers, and so it's in wide use. Once again, I2B2, this is a national center, has been in place now for almost 10 years. And just last week I was in Washington. I'm on the science advisory board for these centers. These centers are now reaching their sunset phase. So initially, these efforts were funded by what's called the NIH Common Fund, which funds big projects. But the rules are they fund big projects for 10 years. 10 years is almost up. All this effort is now needs to find additional funding sources. So here I want to give you an example of why things like this are important, or how this might really impact you. And I just heard this as an interesting talk recently. I apologize for how bad this looks. Okay, so the question is, why does this matter? I'll tell you a little story, and this is by Isaac Kohani, who's the PI of the I2B2 project. So what's plotted here, and I'm sorry you can't read this because this was a video that I took this from. So the time scale here is 1999 to, well, let's see, 1997 to 2005. And what's plotted on this axis is the number of hospitalizations due to myocardial infarction, basically due to heart attacks. And this is, what's plotted here are the results from two, and he said, very well-known hospitals in Boston. Okay. So what you see is nothing, 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 few little blips here, and then big jump in the incidence of heart attacks in these two hospitals. So the question is, what's going on? What's happening with this? So there's also two little arrows here. Here's one arrow here, and here's one arrow here. And so what these arrows represent is, and I'm sure you can't read this, this is the introduction of Vioxx, the COX-2 inhibitor, which is for basically a COX-2 inhibitor that's an anti-inflammatory medicine, works wonderful for osteoarthritis and all these other things, also leads to heart attacks in some individuals. So here's the introduction, here's what happened, here's when it was taken off the market. So during this time frame, what was going on? And also, this medication, there were at least 2 or 3 different clinical trials that had taken place before the medication was released and then afterwards. And the clinical trials did not pull together this kind of association with heart disease. So the other interesting line on this whole little graph here is this little red line down here. What this represents is the incidence of heart attacks over the same time period in hospitals that were part of the Kaiser Permanente healthcare system, which had implemented, prior to this, a whole healthcare database system for managing, for an integrated data sharing management system. For electronic medical records, it's called EPIC. It's been developed over time. And so what happened was, for hospitals that had this data sharing mechanism in place, those patients were detected, their medication was removed. So in fact, it actually saved a lot of lives. And the way that Isaac described this to us when we were listening to his talk is he said, basically, for hospitals that weren't engaged in this and weren't really doing this pulling together of data from lots of different sources across many patient populations. So basically it was like he used a, what did he use? Basically, he said it's like being a pilot in a plane with a plane full of passengers and driving right into what he called a hurricane of morbidity. So what happened to all these patients? And this is because there was no way to put that information together. So that's just a little lesson about why this stuff is important. So let's lighten it up a little bit with a couple of other efforts that I wanted to talk about just briefly. So one of the, and this is how, you know, data sharing can be really fun and also can contribute a lot of really interesting information. And this comes under the kind of category of citizen science. So these are a number of different applications that are out there now that rely on citizens to contribute data, just, you know, basically for fun. So Project Budburst, this is part of the NEON effort. This is a phenology network. So what you do if you're a member of Project Budburst is you pick a tree in your backyard or a plant, something, you geo-reference it. They actually have a little iPhone app for that. And basically you watch it over time. And when the flowers come out, you report it. When the leaves fall off, you report it. And all this information is pulled together and can actually reveal kind of climate trends across the country. This one down here is a really fun thing. This is called Galaxy Zoo. So this leverages off data from the Sloan Digital Sky Initiative. And what it does is there's a whole bunch of data that's been collected that hasn't been categorized, hasn't been annotated. Works through a very simple user interface. You get to pick a picture, and then you get to match the picture with a couple different little icons. What does this look like? And it's interesting because people get on here and they use it, and a number of individual citizens have actually discovered new stars and new galaxies this way, just by analyzing this huge glob of data that's in there. This is eBird. This is the Cornell Ornithology Laboratory. This has been going on since 2002, and it's just basically citizens doing bird sightings. And just for comparison, I don't mean to make fun of this, but just for comparison, I used the same query that I used on Beta1, which was the black-capped chickadee, and this is the amount of information that I got back. So each one of those little purple squares represents a sighting from a community member who is voluntarily contributing this information to the database. And so this is really and this has become a really important source of data for looking at bird migration patterns, effects of climate change, changes in weather patterns, things like that. This is one, I'm not sure how long this has been around by the USGS. This is called Did You Feel It? So this is an earthquake. This is a citizen science monitoring earthquake site. So, and the way that this works, and actually this is updated daily, so I just picked the one that I found today, and this was an earthquake in Chile. So if you click on this, you get this expanded thing. And the way this works, one of the keys of all these citizen science-driven things is that the user interface has to be just really simple, easy to use, and not complicated in terms of getting good quality, well, reasonable quality data. And so the observer, so here's the earthquake's epicenter. These different colored dots represent the strength of the earthquake, or what they felt. And so basically you say, I felt it, scale of 1 to 10, I thought it was a 7, I thought it was a 5, so you can actually collect a lot of good information. So there's a lot, I just kind of cherry picked through a number of different projects. But what's interesting about this, especially for people that are interested in ecological monitoring and all that, really thinking about how to get citizens involved to provide quality observational data is really it's kind of a really interesting new future way to collect information from lots of observers. I just want to end now. It's always nice to end with a pretty picture and reflect a little bit on what I did when I was in Hawaii. This is a picture of reef fish from my colleague Joanne Leong at the Hawaii Institute for Marine Biology. And I put this up here just to remind everyone about how these different communities that are interested in these different types of ecological niches, whatever, are trying to work together to gather information and to preserve some of these things. And so for those of you that know about coral reefs, we know they're very endangered. They're great indicators of climate change and anthropogenic influences. And there, you can't see this in the top, but there's a group called the Coral Reef Ecological Observatory Network, CREON, which is a kind of loosely based set of folks. One of the challenges for these groups, and thinking back to the whole cyber infrastructure stack that you need to do this kind of observational and data sharing, these coral reefs are in very remote places. It's hard to get your sensors out there. It's hard to get the data back. There aren't even networks out there. And one of the projects that I was working on, and I'm still working on a little bit, is an effort to go out and start to network some of these Pacific islands, to put in these networks so that we can get the data back. Now, just like these are really kind of endangered and beautiful environments, the other endangered environment is really our software ecosystem. So one of the major tools that folks that use these buoys that have lots of sensors on them for live data streaming, they use a software application called Data Turbine. This is just a simple way. It's actually a pretty simple application that makes it really easy to live stream data from a bunch of different sensors. It kind of converts the data formats into a common data format that's easy to use. And this was also a project that was funded by NSF for about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, and now is no longer funded. But interestingly, the developers have now turned this into an open source project. And what they're looking for now are developers who want to kind of jump on the bandwagon and help to continue to develop this software and maintain it in the future. So I will leave you with that. What I've done here for any of these slides is to show you all these different links if you're interested in this, and take some questions from the audience. Thank you. Ended almost on time.